Broadcasting from the center of the military universe, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. This is the 18th Airborne Corps Podcast, the official podcast of America's Contingency Corps.
This is Joe Buccino, host of the 18th Airborne Corps Podcast. The 18th Airborne Corps Podcast is the official podcast of the U.S. military. I am the host, Joe Buccino. We record this show in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the base on which the Army's 18th Airborne Corps is stationed. We're wrapping up our Operation Market Garden Bonanza. 9 days, 9 episodes, more than 5 hours of material on Market Garden. So we're 8 episodes in. So this is episode 70, the 101st Airborne. That's the title, the 101st Airborne. One more episode to go after this one. And we've been talking for 7 previous episodes about all of this. Market Garden, by now you know, was 2 parts, 2 components to it. Market, the airborne assault to capture key bridges spread along 60 miles of highway. Then Garden, the ground movement of the British 30 Corps, an armory unit to exploit the capture of these bridges, thrust north, and they would turn east and then pour into the German industrial belt in the Ruhr. Market Garden, if successful, would be a knockout blow. Today, we're focusing on the Market part. Market was a massive airborne assault. More than 34,000 paratroopers and gliders in a daring daytime drop. And go back through the previous 7 episodes for more context on this subject, if you like. Yesterday, episode 69, we focused on the 82nd Airborne Division and its objectives. And today, the 101st. So, to talk about this real critical moment in the history of the Screaming Eagles, I'm speaking with Dr. John O'Brien, the director of the Don Pratt Museum, which is the official Army museum of the 101st Airborne on Fort Campbell, Kentucky. I was there last year, towards the end of last year, and it really is a wonderful museum. You should visit if you have an opportunity to pass by Kentucky or Fort Campbell. And Don Pratt, it's named after Don Pratt, the namesake there, was a 1-star general with the 101st Airborne. If you don't know that story, he was the senior American killed on D-Day when his glider crashed into a hedgerow. And there's a very well-known picture of that. So Dr. O'Brien has a PhD in U.S. and modern European history from St. Louis University. He's, as you would anticipate, a wealth of knowledge on this subject. He's written and thought a lot about the role of the 101st in Market Garden. And there's one element of the airborne component that I always find interesting. I spoke a little bit about it with Dr. John Bonin way back in episode 65, which was the 3rd in this series. So one of the things I find interesting is just all the power dynamics here. And Matthew B. Ridgway, famous paratrooper, by this time he's the commander of the 18th Airborne Corps, and previously commanded the 82nd Airborne Division, was the most qualified, most experienced airborne leader available to command the Market portion. He was the leader who had planned the most airborne operations. He also was central to the development of the airborne force itself. Nonetheless, General Frederick Browning, nicknamed Boy Browning, with the British Airborne General who commanded the British Airborne Corps, really wanted to command this jump. And he wanted this to be his flagship, his legacy. He wanted to command his Airborne Corps into an airborne operation before the war ended. In the end, Browning was selected. Ridgway sat this one out. Part of the reason is the Allied politics. The 1st Allied Airborne Army, which had been called into being on August 2nd, 1944, so by this time, November, it's a new structure. It is a new organization. Really, by now, it's just been in existence just about a month before Market Garden. The 1st Allied Airborne Army is going to lead the Market portion, and the top of that command structure was almost entirely American. It was led by an American Air Force officer, Louis Brereton, consisted almost entirely of American Air Force officers, and in fact, Browning was the only senior Brit. So there's ego and politics all over this thing. And the other component, another consideration here, another factor is Browning and the American officers did not like each other. Both Jim Gavin, the commander of the 82nd, and Ridgway, commander of the 18th Airborne, saw Browning as a ruthless manipulator. He was a careerist, they felt, an opportunist. And Browning also didn't get along with Louis Brereton, the American Air Force officer who commanded the 1st Allied Airborne Army. And there's a story, it's been documented, that during preparations for one of the many canceled operations before Market Garden, Browning had a disagreement with Brereton, and Brereton thought Browning was publicly disrespectful in terms of the disagreement, and then after that, the two men just really disliked each other. Couldn't get along. And really just about all the Americans did not like Browning. Nonetheless, Browning is chosen as the Corps headquarters to add a senior Brit to the command structure. That was a big part of the consideration. And, I should say this about Browning, by the way. He did design and adopt the maroon beret for airborne forces, the same maroon beret that paratroopers wear today. It became the international symbol of the airborne really because of Browning. He introduced it to the British Army in 1942. So, has nothing to do with market garden. There's a story that his wife, a famous English writer named Daphne du Maurier, came up with the color. And there's another story that Browning himself came up with the idea when he saw a paratrooper with a bloody scalp who landed on his head after a bad jump. I don't think that story makes much sense, but nobody really knows the true origin of how he came up with the maroon beret. He introduced it, and now we're talking about Market Garden. He commanded the Corps headquarters for Market Garden. So, get back on course here. Browning was to lead 2 American divisions, the 82nd Airborne led by Jim Gavin and the 101st Airborne led by Maxwell Taylor, and 1 British division, the 1st British Airborne Division led by Rory Urquhart. The reason I say all that, we talk about it here with Dr. O'Brien. So let's bring on John O'Brien. I just spoke with him, and it was a good discussion. He was on the phone from Fort Campbell, from the museum. I was on Fort Bragg. We're talking about the role of the 101st Airborne Division in Operation Market Garden. Here is that discussion with Dr. O'Brien. Thanks for agreeing to do this. As I think I told you last time, we've talked to a number of folks here. We spoke with a couple of British historians, and we looked at the Polish perspective. We spoke with John Arson about the 82nd, so, just kind of wanting to hone in here on the 101st here.
Okay.
So, can you describe broadly the objectives of the 101st in the market portion?
The objectives of the 101st, there were 4 maneuver regiments, the 501st, the 506th, the 502nd being parachute infantry regiments, and the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. The mission of the 501st PIR was to seize the bridges over the Awe River and the Vart Canal at Veckel. So that's going to be where that regiment is focused. The 506th was focused on the bridges at Zonn and Eindhoven. 1 bridge at Zonn and 4 bridges in the town of Eindhoven. The 502nd was to seize St. Odenrode and move out to a division objective. It wasn't one assigned from higher headquarters, to try to grab a bridge at the town of Best. And then the mission of the 327th was to be prepared to augment the parachute regiments with platoon-sized elements as required.
And about 5 months earlier, the 101st jumped into Normandy. That was their first airborne assault of the war. And I believe this was largely the same command structure in terms of the regimental commanders, and you had Maxwell Taylor still at the top.
Correct.
So they jump in day and they seize their objectives. I mean, at least the market portion is a success for the 101st, I believe, within about 40 or so hours. They clear the highways, seize their objectives, and are ready to move on with the next portion.
Right. That was the major mission for them, to seize those canal and river crossings. And as you stated, that was done within 40 hours. The British were moving a little bit slowly getting there, but capturing the route was accomplished by D+2.
This was a mission that was planned by the 1st Allied Airborne Army, and it really was a manifestation of the concept of vertical envelopment. That was part of the reason that we built a 101st Airborne Division at the start of World War II.
As the 1st Allied Airborne Army had been put together, and the divisions involved therein were planning their missions, the 101st, and I presume the 82nd also, and the 1st British, had a specific operational methodology that they followed. I mean, the idea was to land airborne divisions behind enemy lines in order for them to seize and hold key terrain so that an exploitation by a follow-up force could occur. And that planning methodology went into this operation, and the 101st was involved in planning 3 leaps between the time that they were reconstituted in England and the time that they went to Operation Market Garden. And the planning that went into that, all 3 operations, by the way, the objectives were overrun by Patton's fast-moving armored forces, so they never came to fruition. But there was a tremendous amount of planning, especially for logistics, because you have to remember when this operation, when the airborne jump was planned, the 101st had only 5 days to plan the operation from when they got the operation until D-Day on it. And what was so significant is so much staff planning went into those 3 previous jumps that didn't occur that planning this operation essentially became SOP. The jump in originally with the 1st Allied Airborne Army planning things, had planned about 7 drop zones for the division, and the division had learned from the Normandy experience that that wasn't the best way to employ these airborne forces, and this is the 2nd time they're being employed, so it's a pretty big deal. And General Taylor is going to insist on a daytime consolidated drop zone. And so, except for the first of the 501st, essentially the entire division and the follow-on glider echelons all made use of a centralized daytime drop zone, which was phenomenally successful in getting in. You know, the division's going to spread out a little bit to the north to capture the Veckel and then the St. Odin-Rota, and then down to the south to capture the Eindhoven bridges to, connect those together to make the dots. But getting everybody in with hardly any casualties at all, either from the jump itself or from enemy contact, was a huge part of the success of the 101st in that mission. And it comes from understanding strategically how they were being used, the repetitive planning process for echeloning in soldiers and echeloning in supplies, because they're going to end up fighting here an extra number of days because of the battle as it develops. They never suffered from a lack of supply. They had that already pre-planned and wired in.
And the idea behind the daytime jump was that, as I understand it, it first of all gains the element of surprise. They'd previously jumped at night, and then it would facilitate easier consolidation and onward movement to the bridges.
Yeah, I think consolidating the combat power was essentially what they were looking for. Don't spread it out. It becomes too difficult to operate in that manner.
So when we think about this from the perspective of the 101st, it's really a big part of their lore and their World War II history, and certainly in Band of Brothers, there's obviously a great scene that seems very realistic in terms of the mass airborne assault, and it's a great episode from Band of Brothers. So you are in some ways charged with maintaining the history, the legacy of the 101st. So how do you think about this in terms of that lifeline, the broader legacy of the 101st, and particularly its World War II airborne history?
Well, when we're explaining to our soldiers, the legacy of the 101st in World War II and the heritage involved, the 101st jumped 7 miles behind lines at Normandy. They were surrounded, and they beat the Germans. Maxwell Taylor was to famously say, "You've proven that the German soldier is no Superman." The second operation, the 101st jumps 17 miles behind enemy lines and is immediately surrounded in the D6 through D10 phase of the operation. Again, jumping behind lines, being surrounded, which is going to lead to the third major operation of the war. The 101st does not jump into Bastogne, but when it gets into Bastogne, it is surrounded once again. And when McAuliffe was describing after the war the part of the legacy of the division, why he gave the response nuts to the German ultimatum at Bastogne, it was because It was his understanding. We were surrounded at Normandy, and we beat the enemy. We were surrounded in Market Garden and Hell's Highway as the battle developed, and we beat the Germans. And we found ourselves surrounded in Bastogne. It would be nuts to think that a Screaming Eagle would ever surrender or quit. And so that you put that in there. Another part of the division's maturation and a part of the heritage that's important here is in this particular operation, especially guarding the route, keeping the route open between D+6 and D+10 when the German counterattacks were occurring, the division command and control learned to use its assistant division commanders, Gerald Higgins and Tony McAuliffe, to command ad hoc task forces that were put together to repel German spearheads from the southwest, the northeast, wherever the Germans came in. Taylor was using his ADCs, and it's going to be a pattern that McAuliffe learns, so he takes that to Bastogne. And when they're fighting surrounded in Bastogne and he's having to shift forces and put together ad hoc task forces, in the case of Market Garden, the ad hoc task forces are combined because they're going to include British units. And the ones at Bastogne, it's not just the 101st there, it's elements of the 10th and 9th Armored Divisions and an anti-tank battalion and soldiers that were left over from the previous fight that were formed into a task force snafu. So all of these things of how to fight, how to plan the fight, what type of fight it's going to be, and then once engaged in the fight, when you find yourself surrounded, how do you use your senior leaders to address the greatest threats and maximize your combat power through ad hoc task forces? That's kind of the legacy of World War II. Rolled up.
Well, thank you so much for that. I think when we think about Market Garden, the 101st is a component, but it's such an important part, it seems, of that legacy and that story. And I just want to thank you for telling that. I just want to maybe just very quickly cover, I believe it's like the 6th to the 10th day up until about the 25th of September. You mentioned the German counterattacks on the road. I think 101st paratroopers nicknamed that road Hell's Highway. And the Germans interdicted a few times. The 101st held the road. So that was some of the toughest fighting for the 101st of that period, of Market Garden. So what was the significance of that period in holding that highway?
Well, it was the mission that was given to them, and putting the defense together. I think Maxwell Taylor described it this way, and keeping in mind, these are the senior officers here in 1940, were educated 20 years earlier in the 1920s when the Plains Indian Wars were still fresh in the minds of their instructors at West Point. And Taylor makes the comparison, we've been given a mission to protect the railroad across the plains. So that's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. So there was a familiarity to them that might not be readily apparent to us as they were taking on that long stretch of highway against mechanized forces.
Right.
Light Infantry Division, augmented, of course, by armored forces. The British coming through were put to use by the 101st to protect the figurative railroad from figurative enemy attack.
Well, sir, anything else we should be thinking about in terms of the 101st role here in Market Garden?
Well, I think it was a proud moment in the division's history. It's certainly remembered within the division, reinforcing the idea that it's nuts if you ever think a Screaming Eagle would surrender or quit.
Well, Dr. O'Brien, thanks so much. Just appreciate your time here and your contribution to this broader discussion about Market Garden and for everything you do to preserve and engage with the history of the 101st, one of our really most prestigious military units across the country.
Well, it's been a pleasure being with you.
Thanks so much. Take care. See you.
Aerosol.
Aerosol. Okay, that was John O'Brien talking about the 101st Airborne in Operation Market Garden. So we're giving a lot of context, a lot of insight, a lot of information about Market Garden. And it's been a journey. 8 episodes in 8 days, 1 more left. 1 final episode, and then I'm never talking about Market Garden again. Tomorrow, episode 71, we will close it out. And once we close this thing out, we're going to go back to one episode every week, a new episode every Tuesday going forward. So, thank you for listening. Thank you for investing in this history. Thank you for investing in Market Garden and what it means, what it meant at the time, what it means today. And thank you for listening to the 18th Airborne Corps Podcast.